Hi everyone, today I'm going to share with you my basic workflow for editing in Photolab 6 Elite. This tutorial is for people just getting started in photo editing, so I'm going to take a little extra time to explain why I do things in the order that I do them, and also the effects that the individual tools will have on the image. Keep in mind that photo editing can be very subjective, and the adjustments I'll be making are going to be to my own personal taste, and my workflow is certainly not the only one. But I hope you'll find this tutorial helpful in getting you started to creating amazing images. Now, if you don't have Photolab 6 Elite yet, you can download a free 30-day trial from my affiliate links down below. I'll also have links to a couple of the images that we'll be editing today so that you can follow along. So with that said, let's get started. Alright, I've opened up the first image and I haven't done any editing to it yet, and this is a straight out of camera raw file, so it looks a little bit flat, but we're going to see what we can do to kind of spice it up a little bit. And the first thing I always do is apply some of DxO's secret sauce. And that really is comprised of three things. The first one is the DxO optical correction, and this is provided to you via a preset. So we can go over here and just click on number 2, which is apply optical corrections only. And what it does is basically fixes like barrel distortions, vignetting, chromatic aberrations, and also applies a little bit of sharpness. And then the second thing is the Deep Prime XD. So I go into the details panel here and I click on Deep Prime XD, and I just use the automated settings. And again, this will reduce noise in the image and also improve the clarity and sharpness. And then the third and final thing is in the color panel, the working color space. I want to make sure that I'm working in the DxO wide gamut so I have access to the maximum range of colors available to us using Photolab 6. Now just note that the three changes we just made are very subtle, and you may not even notice any difference in the image. Even the new Deep Prime XD, the effect on the image while you're editing is very subtle, and you won't see the full effect until you actually export the image. However, you can preview parts of the image using the loop tool, which I'll show you later. Now let's get to actually editing the image. And the first thing I always like to do is do any kind of cropping and perspective corrections if I need to. And in this image here, I just need to do a slight crop to it. I don't like the top left corner here where there's just nothing but white sky. So I'm going to crop just that part out and then work with the rest of the image. So you do that over here in the geometry panel, and you can click on the cropping tool. And I'm going to zoom out and just crop right in here and then move over, and about right there looks good. And then I'll just hit enter to crop the image. Now you'll also notice that there are some perspective correction tools and volume deformation and reshape, and typically if I need to do any of that, I like to do that right after I do the cropping, but you really don't need to do that on landscapes very often. You typically do this on like your architectural type photography. Now white balance is the next thing I always like to correct in the image, and even though the camera usually does a very good job at correcting for white balance, I always find myself I have to go back and just tweak it just a little bit. White balance also has a pretty big impact on the perceived brightness of the scene. Warmer images tend to look a little brighter than cooler images, so if I want to make an image just be perceived a little bit brighter, I can just warm it up slightly. And that's what I'm going to do here because this image looks a little bit cool. Now to change the white balance, we need to go into the color tools here, and then we go to the raw white balance panel. And in this panel we have several different tools for white balance. We can use a preset like daylight, cloudy, tungsten, shade, and I'm going to choose shade because this scene is in the shade, and see how that looks. And yeah, that's nice. It warmed up the image just a little bit for us. The camera was close, but this is a little bit nicer, I think. The other tool that we have is this pick color. So when I click on this and drag the mouse over the scene, what you want to do is pick a neutral gray part of the scene. And in this particular image, there's not a lot of neutral gray, but the fog itself is pretty close. So I'm just going to pick the densest part of the fog that I can find to get the most gray possible. That looks about right. And yeah, I actually like how that looks. And if we look at the temperature and tint sliders here, you'll see that the value 8731 for temperature, which is in kelvins, and then tint has been adjusted plus 30 or a little bit more magenta. And you can adjust the white balance manually by changing these sliders directly. So if I wanted the image a little bit warmer, I can just slide it over myself. And if I wanted a little more magenta, I can add that here like so. Or if I wanted it to be more green, I can go back this way. But I think the setting that I used with the pick color tool looked the best to me. So I'm just going to go back here and find the densest part of the fog and click on that. And we'll stick with that. And then I need to click on the tool again to deactivate it, or I can hit the escape key on my keyboard. Now the next thing I like to do is start working with the tones of the image, meaning the shadows, the highlights, the midtones. And when I work with these, a lot of times I find I don't need to make adjustments to exposure or even work with the contrast sliders, because adjusting these tones individually, you will get better contrast and a better looking exposure overall. So to work with these tones, we need to go over into the light tools over here. And down here, you'll see where it says selective tones, the highlights, the midtones, the shadows, and the blacks. So first thing I'll do is let me just pull in the blacks a little bit to see if I can add a little bit of contrast. And I think that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to push the shadows slightly just to brighten the image. And I'll push the midtones until I think that looks good. And I'm also going to push the highlights up. And hopefully that'll bring out the fog a little better. Bring the blacks in a little bit. Push the shadows. And again, do this all to taste until you think everything looks pretty good. And I kind of like that. I'm going to push the midtones even more and the shadows. There. Okay, I kind of like how that looks. We still have a nice moody shot, but at the same time, we've added some contrast and brightness to the image at the same time. Now at this point, if I still wanted to make the image a little bit brighter or darker, this is when I go to the exposure compensation slider. So I might just make little baby steps and brighten the image slightly, like plus 0.2, and see how that looks. Or just back it off and go minus 0.2 and see how that looks. But I think in this case, the setting of 0 looks just perfectly fine. Now there's a multitude of other tools down here below. I'll just touch on them briefly. The DxO Clearview Plus, this is basically tries to cut through the haze and fog in the image, which is what I do not want. So I'm not going to use this at all. But if I did want to, cut through some of the haze, you could do it using this tool. I also have a contrast slider here. And I'm not sure if these other two sliders are in your version, because I have like the film pack and some other things installed. But I normally don't need to mess with contrast too much. If I do, again, I just do little baby steps and just add a little bit or subtract a little bit just to see how it looks. But again, in this case, I think we're fine with this baseline. And then down here is the tone curve. That really needs a whole separate other video. So I recommend you don't mess with that at all for now. And then down here is the vignetting, which has been automatically applied through the DxO Optics module. So you can just turn this off and on and see if it makes any difference. And yeah, it did make a little difference. But I'm just going to leave it on. Now the next thing I do is I start to look at the overall colors in the image. Is there enough color in the image? Is it saturated enough? Or do I want to emphasize some colors more than others? Or is there some kind of weird color cast in the image that I want to try and get rid of? And you can do all of that in the HSL panel. Now to get to the HSL panel, you go over here to the color tools. And then right down here, you'll see the HSL panel. And HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. So hue is where you shift the colors. Saturation is where you increase the intensity of the color, and then luminance is where you change the brightness of the color. And again, you want to just make very, very subtle changes here. So when I'm looking at this image, I may want to intensify sort of the reds and orange in this image to give a nice little contrast to specifically this bridge here, which has got some browns in it, which is kind of a red and orange type color scheme. So I'm just going to go here to the oranges and just increase the saturation here and see what that does. And yeah, that's bringing out that bridge nicely. Let's go ahead and spread this out a little bit like so. And I have a whole tutorial on using the color wheel here in the HSL panel, but you can just follow along for now. But I'm just going to expand the range that I'm increasing the saturation here. All right, that looks pretty good, and that's increased the bridge, and I'm starting to see more yellows up here in the trees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the yellow color specifically and see if I can increase the saturation on those. Yeah, I like that. That's good. Maybe make it a little bit brighter as well. Just a little bit. Okay, very good. And then finally, I'm going to go all the way back here over to the red channel. And let's increase that and see what happens. Yeah, just very small steps. Maybe increase the brightness a tiny bit. And yeah, I like how that looks. That kind of brought out a little bit of the grass down here as well. And the bridge. So now I think I have a nice good color contrast between this brownish, red, orangish kind of bridge. There's also some benches back here that I can see a little better. And then of course in the trees and a little bit of light behind the trees. Now the next thing I like to do is work with the vibrance and saturation in the image. More often the vibrance than the saturation. And the difference is vibrance tries to increase the colors or increase the saturation of the colors that are a little bit weak in the image without increasing the saturation of the colors that are already pretty well saturated. Whereas saturation slider will saturate everything at the same time. So I don't like to use that unless the overall image is very, very flat and I want that effect. But vibrance is usually the better place to start of the two. So let's go up to the vibrance and saturation sliders. And I'm going to start with vibrance and just increase that slowly and see how that looks. And it's adding a little bit more punch to the yellows and reds, particularly the bridge and the yellows here, but not so much everywhere else where the greens are already pretty rich. So I think I'll leave it right there. Let's slide the saturation a tiny bit positive, and see, that's looking a little bit too rich for me already. It's not looking like that soft hazy feel that I wanted. And if we back off the saturation a little bit, actually I kind of like that. Now the image looks a little softer, but I'm going to increase the vibrancy just to bring out sort of the key elements in the image, the bridge, and this little splash of color back here of yellow. Now at this point, we're about 99% done with the editing, and what I recommend is you take a little break, whether it be 5 or 10 minutes, or maybe even overnight, whatever works for you. But it's always a good idea to come back to the image with a fresh pair of eyes, because a lot of times you'll see things that maybe you missed, or maybe you overdid, or maybe you want to emphasize even more. So take a little break, come back to it, and then at that point you can get it ready for exporting to share on your social media, or maybe you want to get it ready for printing. So let's take a quick look now at the before and after. So here's the before image, and as you can see, it looks very, very flat now, doesn't it? There's not much color, there's not much contrast, the image looks kind of dim. And then here's the after. And you can see there's definitely a lot more punch and impact to this image. Now that we're almost done with this image, this is when I start to look for little things I might want to fix. Now, this image doesn't really have too many issues. The only things I see is maybe this one little branch up here in the right, top right, and then maybe a little bit of these leaves or whatever this is down in here. These are very minor distracting elements that we can fix with the healing brush. So I'm just going to choose it from the top bar menu here. And I'm going to expand the brush. I just hit the control key and roll the mouse. And I'm going to make it big enough so I can overlap this branch right here. And I'm just going to go over it like this. And that looks good there. And then I'm going to get rid of this one right here. And let me move this down away from the bridge because we're getting a double reflection. Yeah, that looks good right there. Now the last thing I usually do to all my images are local adjustments, and this is where you make changes to very specific areas of the image using control points, control lines, gradients, etc. Now I have a whole tutorial on using control points and things like that for Photolab, but I'm just going to use some of the more basic tools here to get you started, and it can make a very dramatic difference to the final image. All right, to get to the local adjustments, you can click on the shortcut here, which will bring up the local adjustment tool. But what I like to do is bring up actually the local adjustments panel here. So I have a little more control over chroma, luminance, opacity, and I can also, show or hide, reverse. This panel gives you a lot more control over the control points and local adjustments. And like I said, I do have a video covering this in more detail, but we'll just do some of the basic stuff here. So let's go ahead and activate the tool by clicking on that icon. And if we right click on the image anywhere in here, it'll bring up what they call the radial menu. So in here we have various tools we can use. Everyone knows what a brush is, but here's a control point, a control line, and a gradient filter. So let's start with a control line, which is basically like a linear gradient filter. But it's going to be sensitive to the chroma and luminance or lighting and colors in the scene and make adjustments around that. And that's where these chroma and luminance sliders come into play. But let's go ahead and draw a line down here, because what I want to do is make the water in the front a little darker to add some more contrast to the scene overall. Not at the pixel level, but for the scene entirety, right? And I'm just going to bring the blacks in and see how that looks. And yeah, I like how that looks. And then I'm going to push the highlights up to emphasize the fog again. But now I think we got a nice foreground here with a little stronger reflection. I think that looks really good. And then let's deactivate this. And here in the top left, I have some light coming in, but it's not really showing in the rest of the scene. So I want to kind of emphasize the light coming in here from the top left and have it sort of show more here in the scene. So I'm going to use control points in this case, which are just basically radial masks, is another way to put it. And first place I see right here is actually right here on these trees. And let me just expand this a little bit. And over here you have what they call the equalizer, but these controls here, these sliders, are the same things that you'll find in the lighting and color panels over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase the highlights like that. And the sun is coming in from the top left. The sun is generally going to be a little warmer in white balance than, say, the shady areas. So I'm going to go to the color equalizer here and just add a little bit of warmth to the light coming in. And I think that looks good. And again, just do very, very subtle changes. Let me expand this a tiny bit. Now that I've created this control point, anywhere else I click on the scene, it's going to duplicate that control point. So maybe I want to add a little bit more up in here and here. Maybe have it hitting the trees over here. Now this is a little bit too big, so I'm going to make it smaller. And then add some here and here. And I just love how you can just kind of quickly go around the scene and add some points. Maybe all along the front of this tree here. And a little bit down here on the grass. Expand this out. And let me go back to the light panel and just add a little bit more. Let's try highlights. And let's try midtones. Yeah, something like that. And maybe a tiny bit warmer. Okay. This is where I should walk away and come back, right? Because now I'm getting a little carried away. But one last thing I'll do is I want to add a little more contrast here in the forest as well. So I'm going to create a new control point. click in here. Let's make this a little smaller. And let's pull the blacks in here. And then I'll add some more in here and here. Just anywhere that feels about right. Right in there. Okay. All right, now that we're done with the image, let me just show you quickly how you can export this so you can start sharing it on your social media. All right, so let me deactivate the local adjustments tool. And before we actually export, let's go to the details panel and get a little closer look. Because remember how I said that you don't really see the effects that D'XD is going to have on the entire image, but you can use the loop tool to kind of get a small window of what it's going to look like. So what I like to do is click on the loop tool here in the corner and then bring down to an area where I know there's probably going to be some good detail. And then I can expect or inspect in the window here what, or get a feel for what the entire image is going to look like in terms of the noise reduction, the sharpness being applied, and any other anomalies that might appear. And that looks good. Let me click back here. Yep, that looks good. It's bringing out the detail very nicely, I think. So if I felt like there was too much sharpening going on here, because I hear that time to time from people, they don't like how much sharpening is being applied. All I have to do is reduce it here in the lens sharpness slider, and I can reduce it there. And yeah, that looks good. A little bit less waxy, so to speak, right? All right, now I think it's ready for export. So I'm going to deactivate the loop tool, and then I can just right click on the image and do export to disk. I'll select my folder. In this case, I'm just going to select Instagram, my Instagram folder. You want to make sure you select the sRGB profile, because everything on Instagram or online in general is going to be in an sRGB color profile. And this will ensure that the colors you see on your screen are going to match what people see when they look at it on their screens or online. And everything else is kind of optional, but I just leave them all checked. And then we just click on export. And I'm going to overwrite because I've done this image before. And let's take a look at the final image. Well, I hope you found this video helpful. If so, consider buying me a coffee or making a small donation in the links below, because they are greatly appreciated and they help me to continue making videos like this for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I'll always do my best to answer them. And if you have any requests for doing any other kind of tutorials with Photolab or any other editing software, just let me know. I'll give it a shot. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.